So today we are here talking with Aidan McLaughlin. He has an LLM automated hedge fund that he is pursuing. Aidan, tell us about yourself. What kind of got you into this space and led you to your current enterprise?
Yeah, thanks, guys. So I'm in my early 20s. I'm young. And back, I think, a few years ago, my journey kind of started. I was into competitive chess. So, like in high school, college, right? Like I kind of traveled, played around a bit. Going for the national master status, got close, didn't quite get there. And the thing that got me into the AI world, I think, was work on chess computers, right? These engines that
Yeah.
do chess at like a superhuman level. Um, and it was a wild time back in like 2017, 2018, because the best systems that we had for chess, right, were these systems that were hard coded by really clever humans. And they would like look, millions of moves in advance or millions of positions, sorry. Um, and they played chess at a superhuman level. But the funny thing about it, though, and this comes from somebody who, like, is maybe a bit of a nerd about the game, who really liked it, right, is that they started playing like really dry. Like, they would draw every single game, time and time again. Like, tournaments would start looking the same because people just kind of copied these moves from computers. Um, and it got quite boring, right? And people kind of like came out and declared, like, man, like chess is dead, right? Like it is the end of chess, and it was kind of a heartbreaking time for people who love the game. Um, and that all changed in like 2017, 2018, when Google released its AlphaZero program that taught itself how to play chess by playing against itself, like, billions of times. And it started off knowing nothing about the rules, right? We have a Latin word for it. We call it tabula rasa, blank slate, right? And this type of AI system that taught itself how to be the best chess engine in the world, like destroying the previous ones, through just self play was so cool. Because as a kid, I kind of wondered growing up what it would be like to meet aliens, right? And have them tell us how they play chess. Um, and there was a moment after watching this engine that I kind of realized, like, we now know. And that was when I fell in love with AI, right? So after that, I joined the Leo Chess Hero team. It's like an open source project where we like built these chess engines that taught themselves how to play. We won the world championship in 2019, which was awesome. And ever since then, I've kind of been really into AI, especially like the reinforcement learning side, right? I wanted to build computers that thought for themselves rather than merely kind of copying what we do. Um, it was a wild ride since then, right? Like, I went through college and such, and, kind of seeing like the explosion of large language models was, really quite fun. I remember back a few years ago when I was kind of in the space doing research, we were the like kind of small like natural language processing tricks that we'd use and stuff were crazy. It seemed like a dark art compared to today, where you can just like hop on GPT-4 and ask the mysteries of the universe. Um, so that's some of my background in AI, right? Currently run a company called Topology, and we are building AI tools for like deep thought analysis. We're working right now on a project called large lifelong learners, and those are systems that continuously learn rather than kind of having like a set knowledge cutoff, if that makes sense. Um, and the idea is, right, like
Mm-hmm.
cutoff, like, sometimes if you're, old or you're like set in your ways, right, it's harder to like kind of adapt. But I think one really important aspect, especially in fast moving areas like investment and research, right, is the ability to ingest new information, but not merely like just have it memorized, but also form a worldview around it, right? Kind of like continuously adapt your understanding of the universe with new information. That's something that we're really, really interested in. Our first kind of project on this is we're launching a fund, an investment fund. We're kind of like our pitch to our limited partners that we're bringing on. We're raising right now for our fund is it's kind of like Berkshire Hathaway, right? If Berkshire Hathaway had 10,000 more employees and each of them could read like trillions of words per month, right? Because that's what large language models get you, right? And it's right now we're outperforming our benchmark, the S&P 500, by more than 2 times. We found some really, really great limited partners. We're lucky too. Our company is backed by Starship Ventures, which is the same group that has backed companies like Rainmaker, Atmos Housing, like stuff like that. Google, Microsoft both wrote us a check for compute credits, which was nice. And I think this line of research for us about building these systems, right, that can continuously learn over time, is something that we're really excited about because it allows us to kind of like move into domains that we have ourselves very little experience in, right? I don't have a background in investment, but then build machines that can like kind of surpass me, right? That can do really, really well. At some point, I think in the next few months, this is something maybe a bit more excited for than just merely launching a fund. I think we'll bring some of these tools to developers. We'll start building models that you could call through an API. But we can talk a bit more about that later. So there's like the 2 minute rant. Thank you guys. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like what you're doing is really, really cool. I was doing a little bit of research on uh, background research on topology and what you guys are doing, at least what I could find online. And there isn't a ton out there, I realized, but like it was really interesting to read about. So it's good to hear more about it. So with regards to the hedge fund initiative, is the idea that initiative is kind of what will fund? Sorry, and I apologize if maybe you answered this question already. On my side, I think my internet has been a little bit choppy, and you guys were freezing up for me, so I was trying to close out a couple other things that I had realized I still had running. But anyway, so is the idea that the hedge fund effort will kind of fund these other efforts of building, perhaps some open source tools that you publish to developers or a SaaS business later or what have you?
So to kind of give you a history of our project so far, we started off like merely with the thesis that we could build an investment fund, managed entirely by generative AI that outperformed every other long portfolio, right? So that was kind of our starting point. And as we built algorithms and tools to kind of do market research, we started to kind of find out along the way that these tools that we're building are actually really good at a lot of things, not just investment, right?
Yeah.
So I think our company's primary focus is still building a really great fund, because I think that that's going to be like a massive new area in the next few years here. But I think it makes sense though that as AI gets more advanced, it also becomes more general, and I think one of the fruits of our labor is going to be tools for developers as well, because it seems strange, right, to just kind of bottle really cool continuous learning systems up just for an investment fund. I feel like that's kind of like the dystopia that people don't want to happen, right? So I think our business path is very much one of just running with this investment fund, but I think that we love the developer community and we want to put things out there that excite people and allow them to build really cool systems too. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm curious, Aidan, specifically with the hedge fund, like you said, this is potentially a very huge shift for the whole hedge fund industry, this application of AI. So what do you think your fund is bringing right now that some of these other, early stage AI hedge funds are doing as well? Like what sets your fund apart?
Yeah, good question. It's funny. I think AI has been an investment since 1995, right? There's been a lot of work there, and in fact, I think some of the coolest algorithmic advances that we've seen out of AI between 2000 and 2020 were actually from quantitative finance firms, right? People trying to juice everything out of the market with AI. But I think it's kind of exactly that though. These quant firms, right? That's what we kind of call people that use AI in investment. We call them quants. They're really good at building algorithms that take giant spreadsheets of numbers that nobody really has any idea what's going on with, finding patterns in them, and then getting market results. And they've done well, right? I think over the last 20 years, a lot of them have outperformed the market, which is impressive. Some of the largest firms today, like Renaissance Technologies, are quants. I would say that Topology is doing different, that I actually haven't seen really any other AI-based investment company in the world do, is that we're really focused on fundamental research. So we really are kind of trying to take the job of people that read the news every day, who think deeply about the future of technology, right? Who care about a company's performance and the products it launches and the community reception of it. And we're trying to take that process and automate it with superhuman volume, superhuman generality, and I think in the next few years here, superhuman intelligence and pattern recognition too. One thing I think that a fun metric that we like to use is how many words does our algorithm read compared to the top human research firms, right? And I think in the first few weeks of us doing investment research here, we probably topped any other human firm in the world, right? It's ingesting way more information than even a company of 1,000 researchers could, simply because it's much cheaper and more efficient than a human is. I think merely ingesting information is not enough, right? You have to analyze it deeply and kind of have original thoughts about that, and that's something we can talk about later. But I think the biggest kind of difference between us and our competitors is that we're doing fundamental research, and because we're using AI, we're doing fundamental research on a scale that nobody else is.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
It's a lot of fun.
Maybe one follow-up question. Oh, go ahead,
Oh,
Spencer. Yeah,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Jet. So one follow-up question I had is, uh, how does Topology differ from previous automated hedge funds like a Dome Yard, for example? I mean, I can see some obvious broad strokes differences already from what you've described, but I'd be curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, and I apologize too, just to kind of clarify. We're not a hedge fund per se. We are more of an investment fund. We're kind of a more general vehicle.
Gotcha. Okay.
Hedge
Okay.
funds are really like a type of fund that uses like a
Yeah.
bunch of financial instruments to achieve like a lower risk. And we are much closer to like what Berkshire Hathaway does than what like a traditional hedge fund
Okay.
does. Makes sense.
Oh,
Um,
gotcha. Gotcha.
and I,
Okay.
you know, I'm
I'll change my.
no, I've used the word hedge fund in the past too, and I was wrong. And like we're just as
No, I mean, like, it's a subtle difference that does matter.
Yeah.
Because you're describing completely different strategies in the end.
Yeah.
I think people kind of get a sense of it.
Yeah.
So the biggest differences I think that we have versus other AI companies is kind of like I said, we're looking at different things, right? Our algorithms are reading newspapers, right? They're like going through tweets. They're like watching YouTube videos, right? Sometimes they're even like hopping on conversations with like experts in the field and asking them questions. Whereas really a lot of the stuff that has come before us is just like ingesting like tons of pricing information from like exchanges, right? Or like there's so many funny things that like these quant firms have done over the last few years, and I think that looking back, it's kind of evident that it is like a field maybe at the end of its lifetime. Like they're buying up like satellite data, so, like, throw in like how many cars are in the parking lot of like Chinese manufacturing facilities, like stuff like that, right? I feel like anytime your data is that obscure, you're starting to compete in the wrong area. And I think for us, the insight is that like fundamentally companies are driven by consumer sentiment, right? By revenue, and a lot of these things are written by humans who use their products, right? And I think that building an algorithm that works a lot like a human, something that can ingest the types of information that humans are most comfortable with, right? We're not comfortable with like giant Excel spreadsheets of like inscrutable numbers. We're comfortable with like writing about like our experience of the product, or hopping on like Twitter chats with like the employees of the company. Stuff that humans like, and that's I think what really moves stocks at the end of the day. And that's where we're really focusing our data collection on.
That's a really interesting bet.
Yeah.
Jake, what was your follow-up question?
Yeah, I was just going to ask a follow-up that, like, can you walk me through, like, let's say you are pitching to, an LP, a limited partner, they're looking to invest. What, as far as like risk for that limited partner, is this very do they view this as a risky investment, or do they view this as fairly safe? What is kind of your goals with this fund? Do you kind of program in that like risk tolerance into this program? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, no, good question. I apologize. You cut out a bit, so if I miss any parts of my answer here, just let me know. But our target for stock selection right now is like the top 500 largest companies, right? So we're using the S&P 500 as our benchmark, and because we're using it as our benchmark, that's also where we select stock from. So it is a much lower risk than like going with like crazy like high frequency fast moving strategies. Additionally, we're also a long portfolio. So we have like a semi-annual rebalancing. So once we like run our algorithm like a hell ton, right? Like it kind of sits there for a while, and it's quite similar, I think, to traditional investment from like the the Warren Buffett school of investment, if that makes sense. We're looking into different strategies in terms of like more frequent rebalancing and more active like management. But I think as of now, we are a long portfolio focused on large cap stocks, and sometimes mid cap stocks. Our top holdings right now are like Nvidia, Microsoft, Novo Nordisk, like just stuff like that. So like things that you guys know off the top of your head, right?
So you have a at least one partner in this that I could see on LinkedIn and that I've seen you mention on Twitter as well, Neil. So how did you guys kind of get linked up together and come up with this idea to start with?
Yeah, so I met Neil in college. He's a great guy. I love him. He's from Bangalore, India. And the day that I kind of like realized that I really wanted to bring him on as a partner, back when I was in college, have you guys heard of Clash Royale? It's like the video game.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was a professional Clash Royale player for a while. I was ranked like a few hundred in America, and like I was playing with him, and he's like, "Yeah, I play a bit." I'm like, "Oh, okay, we should play." And I of course wanted to play so I could like destroy him, right? And he like beat me like the first 3 games, and he played like 20 games of his life. I'm like, "This guy's a genius! Holy shit!" Right? And of course, like we got to know each other a lot better after that. He's super sharp, like has a really great mind for business. Um, I'm obsessed with AI. I love research, right? I could like sit in my like ivory tower and just kind of like program away these algorithms. He really has a mind for like how to apply these things to the real world that I think that synergizes quite well. So that's kind of the relationship between Neil and I. He's awesome. I love him.
That's awesome. So on the note of college, did you guys drop out to go ahead and run this, or are you still planning on finishing your degree, or what's your plan there?
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting like notifications and stuff. This is buzzing in the background.
No worries.
Yeah, we dropped out of college. I was a junior when I dropped out. I have no plans currently of going back and getting my degree. I was going in for philosophy, mathematics, and computer science, and I think of those 3 fields, I think the one that has the best business prospects in the future is philosophy, which is hilarious. Like, honestly, right? So I think right now, if I were talking to my peers, right, like of my age, I don't think I would tell them to drop out of college. But for me, there is this great Mark Zuckerberg quote that I love from like 20 years ago. Actually, no, it wasn't a Mark quote. It was a Peter Thiel quote to Mark. And he said to Mark, as time goes on and as technology progresses, right, the biggest risk becomes not doing things that are historically risky, right? And it's just like this, and it, like I don't know, like I'm a statistic nerd, and I kind of like didn't really grasp the risk of kind of continuing on a current path, like staying in college, like really not launching a company, stuff like that. I kind of like forgot to assign it like a risk value. You know what I mean? It just seemed like the default case, and then doing anything else had a risk to it. But I think I started to kind of realize, especially after talking to some really sharp people, kind of in the San Francisco startup scene, that there is a lot of inherent risk associated with not taking actions that are historically perceived as risky. So I think that's one of the reasons I dropped out. Another much more simple and candid explanation is I just love AI so much that I couldn't really stand to like be in classes where we're using like they're teaching like gradient descent for the 30th time back as if it was like 1998 still. And I think that I feel much closer to the state of the art in AI research. Talking to people online, meeting with people in real life than I was at university. Unfortunately, I think it's just the area has shifted, right? And it wasn't always the case. I think that back like 15 years ago, the coolest AI research was done on like Stanford's campus, and today it's just unfortunately not the case anymore.
Yeah.
It's funny that you say that. It's like part of me for like I'm going back to school here in a little bit, and part of it was so that I can talk to more people online and like have a better grasp on like the fundamentals of what we're talking about. It's not to go find people at the university to talk to about AI. Like I want to go pick up some skills that I should have picked up a few years ago and dig deeper.
Yeah, I apologize too.
I mean,
I'm not
and
trying
it's
to...
interesting. That was like Spencer and I. That's a large reason we wanted to jump in and start this podcast, was because the field is moving so fast. We felt like, if you wait, there is a risk factor there that you're going to miss out. You're going to miss the ride. You're going to miss the being part of something that's changing the world. And so that's why we started this podcast. Is we want to document this. We want to see, the Aidens who are dropping out of school with AI in its infancy to start these new tools, build these new tools, because who knows where it's going to be in 20 years, if just what it'll look like, or 10 years, 5 years. Right now, it's like this rush. All these innovators, all these people like you who are like these strategists, world champion chess players, are like, okay, I love AI. Let me apply this to real world scenarios. And it's been fascinating to see the diverse application of AI to every single industry. Like I'm in accounting, and we've kind of talked about that on the show before, but it's revolutionizing the accounting industry for sure. And so accounting we've seen, health, like health workout plans, like it's just touching everything. So
love that.
I guess with that, Aidan, I'm curious, where do you see AI going in the next, year, 5 years? Like, what's kind of your perspective?
It's a good question. I think I'll start by kind of dodging the question in a funny way. I love the word, Werner Vinge, who coined the term singularity, passed away recently, and I loved him. He was a fantastic author. Um, and it's funny, the word singularity, right? Like, that's what we refer to, like AI getting crazy. He coined because in physics, right, it's like a point of no return. Like we actually just don't know what happens past a singularity, right? Like it's less that it's like a single point, right, which I feel like the singular and it kind of like implies, and more that like it's just the point of where our understanding breaks down, if that makes sense. And I think the same is kind of true with AI. I think that in a year or 5 years, it gets harder to predict what happens in the world than any previous time in history, if that makes sense. So I think like so far the hardest year to predict what happens in future years ever has been 2024, right? Like I just think it's each next year is going to be similar. I think part of that is because the complexity of the system is some factor of like the net intelligence in it, if that makes sense. And with AI, there's just going to be a lot more net intelligence, which means the system will be kind of harder to predict. But also, like, things are just fun, man. Like, I think that, like, as the temperature turns up, like, things bounce around in more unpredictable ways, and I think that's also kind of cool. And I think the temperature certainly is turning on. But, to kind of answer your question directly, and I apologize for, like, doing the cop-out, like, disclaimer.
That's great.
I think over the next 5 years, it's going to be quite apparent that we have systems that can do at least we have systems that can do the intellectual labor of any human working remotely. I think that's probably going to happen by like 2025, 2026, if I had to guess. That's crazy, right? Because that like is probably the majority of economically valuable labor that humanity produces, right? As things that could be done like through a laptop if you wanted to. Now, by 2026, do I think that everybody that could do a remote job will not have a job anymore? No, I think it'll probably take a bit longer to get there. But I am of the camp that AI is coming much faster than people expect, right? I think that these systems are much more powerful and much closer than I think the average person or even the average AI researcher has an intuition for. But I also think that their effect in the world, at least in the immediate future, is going to be a bit less than people would expect, given the magnitude of progress. Okay. So in the next year to 5 years, I think we will have extraordinarily competent systems, and I think they will change the world a bit less than we expect.
Interesting. Yeah,
that kind of jives with.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
No,
I was just going to say like that kind of jives with how I feel about it, which is that these systems are much more powerful than what people are predicting, but also like they're not quite as powerful as some people hype them up to be, right? Where it's like there's still a ton of inertia in real world systems, like, and you see this anytime if you've done literally any type of software development work that's like B2B or tried to sell yourself as an independent consultant developing software for people, right? Like there's a lot of inertia that you have to go through first, because there's a ton of preferred processes that are currently in place for these businesses and for these industries that you have to fight against. And even though you are presenting in many ways like what is, at least in your opinion, an objectively better solution that doesn't solve for the thousands of people who are attached to their current process, and like you have to, the more attached they are to that process, the better your tool has to be in order to break through that inertia. And
I love that. Like I'm gonna plagiarize that from you and not give you credit, Spencer. Oh
no, go for it. That's what I'm here for. I'm trying to spread my intellectual memes.
But inertia, that's such a great way of describing it, though, right? Because when an object has inertia, like it doesn't matter if a larger object comes around, right? It still there's still a property associated with it that makes like the magnitude of a collision different, right? I don't like
exactly.
It's like kind of an unintuitive thing, right? But I think you nailed it. I think that there are so many existing systems that'll take a bit longer to switch over than people expect. But I thought your point about making systems that are better than they need to be to overcome kind of like that, like static friction, if that makes sense. I agree with that in some domains very strongly, right? Like I think, maybe Jacob, you can speak to this, but I'm guessing for accounting, right? Like we won't have AI replace the majority of accounting until it is like massively better than the human, right? Which is kind of like an unfair like benchmark, but it's the same thing with self-driving, right? Like, I don't want a Tesla who drives as good as a human to drive me around, right? Because that's like terrifying. I want a Tesla that drives like 10 times than any human on Earth, right? Like that's the threshold. And I think that goes for many domains. And I think you guys both nailed it there. For some areas, though, I think it's actually kind of like a funny, profitable opportunity, right? I think that it is. I think that, for investment, that's one of them, right? I think my biggest competitors have hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on like R&D and research. And like, if they wanted, right, they could probably go out and, like run GPT-4 many more times than my company has the resources for, right? Which is, in one way, like wildly disheartening. Like it may, at first glance, it seems like, their topology screwed. There's no way we're going to compete. But the hilarious thing is that we just haven't seen that. In fact, like most of the largest, like fund managers in the world have come out and said, like, we are proudly not using generative AI because we don't think it's like accurate enough yet to like, for our use case. And I think sometimes there's truth to that. I think that, my very strong opinion on this is, maybe I'm a bit biased, of course, is that, if there exists inherent failures of these systems, engineer around them, right, and like fix them. And I think that that's something that we are doing very happily, right? But I think one of the ways that I'm excited to see topology move forward is to profit off of the inertia of others. You know what I mean? I think that as it takes a while for these funds to like look at their massive, well-paid like 10,000 employee workforce, and as these funds like look at their large heavy infrastructure for like doing fundamental research, it's just going to take a really long time for them to make the full switch to generative AI. And luckily, because we're we were born in that area, right? Like there is no switch for us. The cost of switching is zero because that's where we started. You know what I mean? And of course, I think history repeats itself often here, right? Like I think that when the internet came around, there were a lot of similar things going on where there were companies that like had way more resources to like compete with Amazon or something, but they didn't win, not because like they weren't well funded enough, but just because they were too slow, right? They had like legacy stuff in place that made it really hard. So I think it goes both ways. I think that the inertia of AI will make it apparent that some fields take much longer than expected to like be revolutionized, and I think in other ways it'll be the opposite. I think some people will greatly profit off of like that kind of slowness of others. If that makes sense.
No, yeah, that makes total sense. It'll be very fascinating to see, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, Aidan and Spencer, if you have any too, but because we've seen kind of a pattern, right, in the past 20 years, especially with technology. For example, there's the Apple, right? Huge company, or the Microsoft, where a lot of their R&D, honestly, is just acquisitions, right? They just like wait for these startups to like get things figured out, and then they're like, all right, we'll buy you now. And then they incorporate it into their massive organization. And it's been interesting with AI, Elon Musk putting Grok open source. Like there's this trend to like make it open source, right? To make it available.
Yeah.
Do both of you think that will continue? Do you think there's a risk of like a Microsoft, an Apple, or a couple huge organizations just kind of coming in with their resources and being like, all right, we'll take all of this AI now and pay us for it? Like, do you think that's likely? Do you think it's going to stay open source?
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to try summarizing your question to make sure I got it so I answer it well. You're asking, do you think that AI will entrench really large players and kill kind of like competition, or if open source and kind of like smaller players will benefit? Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think, and this is actually quite controversial, but I think that AI is going to change virtually no existing patterns in the progress of capital that we've already observed. And I fight with a lot of people about this. I fight with like OpenAI staff. I fight with like economists. They're all wrong. I'm always right, but I think like the lesson for me, I think, is that institutions with like superhuman intelligence, right? We call them corporations, right? If your corporation doesn't in some way have superhuman intelligence, you are not going to make it. Like that's kind of the point of like forming these organizations. And yet, even though they should be much more competent as an organization than any like small group, startups still succeed often, right? Like we see David's topple Goliaths all the time, and I think that the nature of innovation is like a funny cosmic ladder, where if you're intelligent, you can kind of like purchase lottery tickets, right? That have a chance of success. And large companies, right? They have a lot of resources to purchase these lottery tickets, and that's why they often become more successful. Sometimes they purchase a lot of lottery tickets and it just doesn't work out, right? And like they go on a funny losing streak and like they collapse. And sometimes like a small player can purchase these like lottery tickets of innovation and catapult upwards, right? Like kind of like unexpectedly. And I think the nature of intelligence will not be changed by AI. It will just be more democratic, if that makes sense. So today, like the amount of lottery tickets that you can purchase is some factor of like the amount of resources you have, and also just like your innate intelligence, right? Like it might be that like the net intelligence of an organization like Microsoft is of course way higher than like 2 or 3 people organizing a startup. But I think the average intelligence might not be. It actually might be significantly lower. You know what I mean? And I think AI will change that, where as AGI companies like OpenAI and Anthropic and whoever start releasing really powerful systems to the public, I expect the intelligence per dollar that we have will stay very constant, if that makes sense. Like no longer will like a few sharp people working at a startup be able to topple a large organization merely by the fruits of like their genetic intelligence. But long story short, though, sorry, I think I kind of went off on a limb there. I apologize. I really think that the nature of like economic success will not change. If anything, it will probably benefit smaller players as the space of opportunity to develop in opens up. You also kind of asked a question about open source. You mind if I tackle that real quick too?
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Thanks. I expect open source work in AI to follow the same trend as other open source industries in the past, where in its infancy, it's quite popular, right? Because there's less economic kind of upside. And it doesn't really diminish, but it seems to diminish relative to the research done by private companies, if that makes sense. So like the absolute amount of open source work done probably increases over time, but the relative amount of open source work done compared to like all the AI research in the world will surely decrease, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think we're kind of seeing the beginning of that too already in some ways. In that, I mean, OpenAI was never truly open source, right? But they did used to release a lot more details about their models, and their white papers used to be a lot more detailed. And they've got a lot of flack for that, but I sort of understand like where they're coming from. Like this is, I'm not a extinction risk type guy. I don't think that there's probably an extinction risk, but that's true of any sufficiently transformative technology, right? Like, burning hydrocarbons is an extinction risk, but it's also led to a ton of progress in society and in the world. But anyways, moving on from that, kind of carrying on with the inertia metaphor, I think that this is somewhere where, there's a lot of people that we've talked to who are kind of pessimistic about the ability of startups' ability to survive in the coming environment. And I kind of understand where they're coming from, because on one hand, like you said, like you can buy a lot more lottery tickets. So these larger companies, they're going to be able to deploy AI as well. But I think that a lot of people who are pessimistic about startups really overestimate large corporations' willingness and what's the word, organizational ability to deploy these resources in an effective way. Because as you get larger and larger, like deploying your resources becomes a more and more complicated effort. It's why if you read Sun Tzu's Art of War, like every single thing he talks about is like logistics. Like it is it's kind of the core principle of any organized exercise is logistics. And a lot of these larger companies, like they start to have really poor logistics at the upper end. And that's where I think startups still have a ton of edge in the current environment and in the coming environment. I'm fond of saying that like execution is the only moat that matters. Because like if you're a small startup, all you have to do is execute. And I think that AI will provide a significant advantage to a lot of startups in that way. The whole cliche of being lean and hungry, I think, does hold true. But that's the end of my little riff on that.
Oh yeah. I wonder, like in 2030.
No, yeah,
Go ahead, start, Jake. All you meant.
Oh no, go for it, and you're good.
Okay. All right. So, sorry to interrupt. Like I wonder in 2030 when startups are using AGI to build their products and Microsoft's using AGI to like further their products. Will the Microsoft AGI have to like talk to the other AGIs to get permission to like build something and then like make sure it adheres to like the correct design doc and then like talk to the VP AGI that like is kind of an asshole. Like you're right. Like there's so much. Right? And I think that bureaucracy isn't a factor of intelligence. It's just a factor of like size. You know what I mean? So
yeah, and that's a very interesting area that I've just tried to keep tabs on, is just these, especially like governments where they're like, the election's coming up and they're kind of freaking out about the application of AI, and they're like the social media platform, like all these institutions are just like, how do we cope with the capabilities of AI? And I think it's going to be very fascinating in the coming years and months, days, like how it's regulated, how they're going to, make sure what you're seeing as news is actually accurate. How are they going to regulate that this work of art that someone created is theirs and someone's not copying it? The music, just all these different, especially like the arts, all this stuff. It's going to be fascinating in the coming months to see what regulation is instituted and if it happens more at a government level or institution level. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on that, but I'm very intrigued.
Will OpenAI be like the next global government, right? Is that kind of like what we were asking? Like, will our rules around from like the Pioneer Building in San Francisco?
Exactly.
Yeah, I'll tackle that real quick if you don't mind, and then Spencer, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts on that. I think it's quite clear to me that AI, barely more capable than what we have today, will be dangerous. Like it just could be used for bad things, right? I really lean like quite libertarian, just in terms of like regulation, and I am not fond of a world where we have like pause AI people kind of like seeping into government and stopping our training of like larger language models. But I think that one important thing, right? I think about like my economic view of the world, and you might disagree. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Is that regulating a free market is not a paradox, right? Like that's not like like those are words that can be uttered in the same sentence. And I think an example of this, right, is that when I take away somebody else's ability to engage in like free market activities, right, like by, let's say I like kill you, right, like then you can't create like economic value. You know what I mean? We have regulation around that because we have to kind of make that trade-off between creating value and stopping other people from not creating value, right? And it seems quite clear to me that the fastest path of AI research, or the of capabilities improvement, like the most the fastest acceleration, right, involves some sort of regulation to make sure that these AI systems don't make it harder for us to get to that point, right? Like they are not like, spreading like massive disinformation. They are not like, corrupting like minds through like superhuman persuasion. They're not really trying to like, destroy society in like this kind of subtle way that I think is totally possible. Maybe a bit more possible than we'd like to admit. There's this great quote from, I forgot his name, but like something Mario. He's like a famous like F1 racer from Italy, where he says, like it's crazy at like the Formula One level how many people think the brakes are for slowing down. You know what I mean? And I believe quite similarly with AI research, and I'm sure that like my company at some point will be regulated, right? Like both being in like the finance space and also making like capable models, like it will come someday. But I think that's important because I think that lack of oversight here will just make it harder for us to make progress.
Yeah, I feel very similarly, where regulations are clearly going to be needed. Like you were saying, it's just going to be a completely unfair environment if they don't come. I'm not going to claim to be well versed enough in the public policy issues to have like honestly like a real deep opinion on what those regulations should be or look like. Yeah. I try to stay out of those conversations because it's one of those things where like, dude, like I'm out of my depth. Like I would be detracting from the conversation if I contributed, if I tried to contribute too deeply here. But generally speaking, I feel like there needs to be a bias towards it, kind of a lighter hand here right now. With AI still so young. We need the freedom to develop the technology and figure out what it's really useful for. Because there's already a lot of obvious things that it's useful for, but we don't know what else is out there yet. Like it's still so young. Any regulations that are too heavy-handed are going to, like you were saying, Aidan, like they will just kill progress. Excuse me. Like simple one that I see a lot of people complaining about online is like that like LLM shouldn't be anywhere near medicine. It's like no, my father-in-law is a doctor, and like literally like the first thing that he asked me about when I started talking about LLMs was like if they could be applied to medicine. Yeah, doctors are excited about this. Like we should be exploring all avenues. Like
for sure.
We don't know what kind of weird knowledge is trapped inside of these things.
Yeah, and I mean the trend, right, is like in order for change to happen, is it maybe a good example is like in the United States, right? The West early on was like, the gold rush. There was just this like potential huge upside to the West, completely unregulated, very dangerous. You could lose your life, but like that upside is just massive if you're willing to take that risk. Sure. And it's almost like that's where we're at with AI. It's like a lot of it's unregulated. You could flop. You could lose out, but there's a huge upside. But what's amazing is like it's making that downside way less impactful for anyone because you can buy more lottery tickets for nothing. You can just increase your chances. Aidan, I'm curious what as we're starting to kind of wrap up here, what advice would you give to small business owners, small entrepreneurs who maybe are just a more traditional startup? What advice would you give them in this AI space? Sorry, maybe it cut out?
Yeah, it did. I'm so sorry. I just heard the last words. Did that cut out? So go ahead one more time.
No, you're totally good. What advice would you give to small, startups, entrepreneurs who maybe are more traditional that aren't specifically an AI investment fund, but just a traditional entrepreneur who's starting a business, but there's this AI craze? What advice would you give to these people who are maybe scared that AI could topple their business, or I don't know, just any advice you have for an entrepreneur?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in like historically, right, we look for different qualities in founders, right? Like venture capitalists have long lists of what they look for. I think like speed of execution is a big one. Like how personable you are, like how intelligent you are, obviously. And I think as time goes on, the balance of those qualities kind of differs, right? And it's not, I'm not saying this as in like, you are either born with it or not. I think these are just things that people can like focus more on. And I think today, the most important quality to care about leading a startup is far and away vision of the future, right? It's just like, what do you think is going to happen in the future? And I think the reason why that's becoming more important now is because the upside of kind of having a good model of how things are going to play out is so much more important, because the future seems likely to diverge from the past much more now than it ever has been in human history, if it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I think the competitive risk, in a funny way, is really it's no longer being bad at like launching a product. It's no longer like being bad at like executing fast. I think it's just going in the wrong space. I think that is the biggest risk a startup would face right now. And I'm not saying that like like my company Topology has totally cracked the code or something, right? Like the future is very blurry, and I think that we have a lot of work to do. But I see often, and I think I'm seeing this more and more now in the last few months than I think I've ever seen in my life, companies emerging with incredibly sharp teams, right? Like the smartest people, like amazing speed of execution, all of these things. And then their core product gets obsoleted by like an OpenAI release like a few weeks later, right? Or like, their core product like, is sorted by Devin or something like that. That's heartbreaking, right? Because like, not to be weird, but like I almost kind of feel like smart people shouldn't, they don't deserve that, right? Like they should be protected or something. But like it's just, it's how the world's moving right now. And I think there was this advice that like Sam Altman and Paul Graham and people during the 2010s kind of gave to founders, and that was like, don't worry about the idea, you'll figure it out, like if you're smart enough and nimble enough and such. And right now I think that is like deeply untrue. I think that like now more than ever in history, like you really have to have a fantastic idea of where you're going and why it's defensible in the long run, and why like just how the future is going to play out. And I found that interesting. I think ironically, AI, I think, will be a really good tool for advancing that. I think that, as these systems start to have better foresight, they will, help us determine where to put our energy better, if that makes sense. Of course, everybody else will also have it, which will make it complicated, kind of just like investing. As the number of like smart players in the market increases, the harder it is to make money. But yeah, so that's my long story short. If I were to give you like a one sentence answer, I think we should value vision now above all other qualities and in startups.
Yeah, no, I love that. The long-term vision is never more important, has never been more important. That's so true.
All right. Well, I think that covers all the questions that we had. Jake, do you have any more?
Let me think. Not right now. This has been great, Aidan, really. And if anyone wants to keep up with your journey, Topology, you personally, where should they reach out? Where should they follow?
I have a lot of
maybe
fun.
Give us some of that information.
Twitter is where it's at. So I would think there for now. I'm excited. I think we'll have some updates kind of publicly facing in the next month or two here. And I think that, like if you guys kind of like a sneak peek, we're going to be launching some products. I think for developers, we're going to be expanding the size of our fund. So fun stuff like that. Guys,
wow,
you guys are wonderful interviewers. Thank you so much for this chat. This is like, I rarely have an opportunity to talk to smart people in a public way like this. So thank you so much.
Thank you for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Well,
yeah.
Really glad that we ended up making it work.
Yeah.
I'm glad it worked as well. Thanks for being flexible. Aidan, we would love to stay in contact as well. I know things are moving so fast, so maybe in a few months, 4 months, 5 months, I don't know how long, but we'd love to reconnect and even do another, chat again and see where things are at, because I have a feeling you're going to make so many pivots in the coming months and adapt so much that it's going to be really cool to see. So let's definitely stay in contact.
Definitely. We should talk again for sure. Awesome. Thank you guys. I hope you're well.